You are not lacking motivation. You are in mourning. The whole world taught you to run, but never taught you to stop. And when spiritual awakening came, it didn't bring peace. It brought a funeral. The funeral of your ego, of your goals, of the persona that pretended to have purpose. Carl Jung warned, awakening doesn't first expand you, it destroys you. You haven't lost your sense. You just saw how false your sense was. And now what moves you is not ambition, it is emptiness. This very emptiness that the world fears is the beginning of the self, the birth of the real. But be careful, because the ego will try to convince you that you are broken. He will send you back to the noise, to the rush, to the disguise of motivation. And if you do that, you will die without ever having lived. Here we don't romanticize awakening, we cross it. If it tears you apart, if it makes you tremble, if it makes you feel alive again, so sign up now, because no one here will spare you the truth. There comes a moment when the body still moves, but the soul has already stopped. Nothing pushes you, nothing pulls you. What once got you out of bed, dreams, goals, achievements, now seems like a distant echo of a time that no longer belongs to you. Carl Jung called this the death of the provisional life, the collapse of the entire psychic structure that supported the persona you believed yourself to be. And it is a real death, not of the body, but of illusion. Everything that motivated you was sustained by an internal system that no longer exists. The ego, accustomed to confusing movement with meaning, begins to panic. It tries to revive the old flame. It seeks new goals, new loves, new beginnings, but nothing reignites. Because what died here wasn't interest. It was the false fuel that kept it burning. The void arrives like a desert, silent, hot, relentless. And you discover that there is nothing more terrifying than silence itself. This is the point where the human being feels broken, but is actually being stripped bare. The death of the temporary life is not ruin, it is revelation. What falls away is the mask that bore the name self. You look around and realize that most of your life was built on avoiding feeling. Work was a distraction, love was an escape, faith was anesthesia. Spirituality promises you light, but true awakening first delivers darkness. This is where the self begins to whisper. And what it says is not sweet. It says, stop trying to go back, stop saving yourself, just die. Die to the character, to the rush, to control. The ego calls this failure, but it is childbirth. It is the collapse of the artificial movement you called purpose. Jung said that the human spirit only begins to live when the false must die. And when the false dies, everything falls silent. But it is in this silence that the soul breathes again. At this stage, the body still tries to function in the old rhythm, but the spirit refuses. You try to be interested, but nothing stirs. You try to exert yourself, but the effort seems directionless. And the world around you, with its haste and noise, calls you apathetic. They don't see that you are going through the most sacred moment of your life, the decomposition of the self. The void is the altar where the self begins to reveal itself. It doesn't manifest itself in euphoria or epiphanies, but in pauses, hesitations, paralysis. You feel something calling you, but you don't know what, and yet you know you can't ignore it. This is the silent call of awakening, the beginning of the journey. And if you have the courage to remain in this non-place, where everything solid has crumbled, you will realize that the void was never absence, it was preparation. And what is about to be born from there, though still invisible, is the first breath of what Jung called authentic life. There comes a time when life begins to reveal itself as a sophisticated lie. Everything you called purpose was, deep down, survival disguised as meaning. Your brilliant career was just a plea to be seen. Your stable relationship was an attempt to avoid feeling alone. Even your spiritual quest, so noble at first glance, was an ego disguised as a saint, trying to reach heaven only to escape its own hell. Carl Jung called this psychic substitution, when humans create external goals to hide internal deficiencies. And when awakening occurs, these substitutions no longer hold up. What once seemed like a divine calling begins to reek of self-deception. The soul begins to see through the trick, and the trick has always been to try to fill the void without listening to it. The collapse of false purpose is not a spiritual failure. It is the cleaning of the unconscious. It is the moment when the self dims the theater lights and forces you to see the empty stage. This phase is cruel because the ego believes it's losing everything, when in fact it's being liberated. What we called ambition was the fear of becoming invisible. What we called love was the addiction to being chosen. What we called faith was the need for control by another name. And when awakening peels away these layers, the human being tastes the taste of abstinence. The addiction to importance dies, and silence replaces goals. Everything you once did with passion now sounds artificial and rehearsed. The body still tries to repeat old habits, but something inside refuses. It's no longer possible to lie to yourself. Spirituality here ceases to be a path of conquest and becomes a cemetery, the place where you bury every illusion that moved you. Jung said that suffering is the soul's resistance to its own growth. And that's exactly it. You're not depressed. You're being deprogrammed. You're learning to stop seeking outside what has always been inside. It is at this point that silence becomes pedagogical. It teaches that true purpose is not found but revealed, but only after the false dies. The self, in its wisdom, creates collapse as a remedy. It destroys what you idolize to restore the original meaning of existence, simple being. And that is why emptiness hurts so much, because the ego translates presence as uselessness. It doesn't understand the value of doing nothing. It doesn't know how to rest in the absence of function. But emptiness is fertile. It is in it that the call begins to be heard, not as a commanding voice, but as a presence that invites. You still don't know where to go, but you feel something being born, like a murmur within your chest, almost imperceptible. It is the beginning of invisible reconstruction. The collapse of false purpose is the exact point at which the character dissolves and the real being begins to breathe. And when the ego tries to run from this silence, it discovers something even more disturbing. Time no longer obeys it. There's a moment, after the collapse of purpose, when time ceases to make sense. You wake up and feel that tomorrow no longer exists as a promise, and yesterday has lost its power to justify who you are. The clock continues to tick, but your spirit doesn't move. Linear time, this invention of the ego to maintain the illusion of progress, begins to dissolve. Carl Jung called this the rupture of psychological time, the end of the internal narrative that said the future would bring salvation. And when this structure collapses, the mind panics. Because without a future, there is no motivation. Without a past, there is no identity. It's as if life has stopped and you're trapped in an eternal instant, watching everything happen without participating in anything. The ego tries to escape, seeking new deadlines, new plans, new goals, but the self prevents it from returning to the old rhythm. It's as if the soul has turned off the timer and said, "Now, you will learn to exist without rushing." The end of psychological time is a silent earthquake. It destroys the system of meaning that sustained all of humanity. From an early age, you were taught to live for what comes next, study for the future, work for the future, love for the future. And suddenly, the future dies. Nothing promises redemption anymore. It's an invisible mourning because no one understands what you've lost. To the world, you only appear unmotivated. But inside, what died was the last god of the ego. tomorrow. And this is where awakening becomes dangerous. Because without tomorrow, the mind loses its nourishment. It tries to recreate the old addiction. It begins to plan the new me, the next stage, the spiritual future. But everything collapses again. The self accepts no substitutes. It demands total presence. The soul begins to grow accustomed to slowness, to the silence between impulses, to not knowing. And this not knowing, for the ego, is torture. For the self, it is a portal. It's at this portal that something changes forever. You realize that life isn't going anywhere, and that this isn't a mistake, it's the mystery itself. Psychological time was the trap that made you run in circles, believing you were evolving. But awakened consciousness shows you that there's no finish line, because there's no race. There's only the now, vast, dense, infinite. Jung said that the awakened mind lives in the eternal present, and that this present is so vast, it seems empty. But this emptiness is the womb of reality. It's from it that the first breath of true freedom emerges, the power to be without needing to arrive. You begin to realize that the only evolution is dissolution, and the more time dissolves, the more the self reveals itself. But the ego, without this line of progress to measure itself, collapses, because without time, there is no comparison. And it's in this collapse that the comparing mind finally dies. The ego is a hungry child who only learned to exist by being observed. From an early age, you were trained to measure yourself by applause, grades, likes, validation. Life became a stage, and the gaze of others, your nourishment. Carl Jung said that the ego is not a real entity, but a fragile reflection, and every reflection needs external light to continue existing. This is why the ego compares. It needs difference to feel identity. As long as there is someone more beautiful, richer, more spiritual, more awakened, they still have a role in the game. But awakening is the light that extinguishes the theater. When consciousness begins to see beyond the masks, the mirror shatters. Suddenly you look around and realize that there is no better or worse, only distinct expressions of the same self trying to recognize itself. This vision is liberating but also disorienting. Because the ego, without the yardstick of comparison, loses its footing. It asks, "Who am I if I can no longer win?" And the self silently answers, "You never needed to win, you just needed to be." At first, this death is cruel. It's like losing the language the world speaks. People continue to argue about who has more, who is more evolved, who is right, who is wrong. And listening, you feel a hollowness in your chest. The game has lost its luster. The race has lost its meaning. Your entire social life seems to revolve around proving something, and you feel no desire to compete. But the ego doesn't give in easily. It tries to resurrect itself, creating new forms of comparison disguised as humility. I'm more detached than they are, more conscious, more awake. Even spirituality becomes a stage for the spirit's vanity. Jung warned that the ego is a skilled actor. When the character dies, it tries to revive itself by playing the role of the enlightened one. That's why awakening is so dangerous, because the ego wants to steal even transcendence itself. But the awakened soul is not impressed by sacred garments. It sees that comparing levels of consciousness is as childish as comparing moons by brightness. Each reflects the sun in its own way. Neither is more or less light. It just carries a different story of darkness. And when this truth pierces you, silence sets in. It's a frightening silence because it offers you no direction. Without comparison, you don't know what to seek or what to avoid. It's the end of the social compass. Old conversations lose their appeal. Old idols lose their authority. Old goals lose their meaning. The mind, addicted to competition, feels withdrawal. And this emptiness is mistaken for loss, when in fact it is liberation. You begin to realize that comparing is a type of violence, an attempt to reduce the mystery of the other to the measure of your fear. Each being is a unique architecture of shadow and light. Comparing destinies is like comparing storms. Each carries the weight it needed to teach the sky to rain. This is where true compassion is born. You stop seeing rivals and start seeing mirrors. And the more you understand this, the more your mind becomes silent, because deep down it always knew comparison was the disguise of envy, and envy was the fear of not being loved. When this fear dies, what Jung called the gaze of the self is born, the gaze that contemplates without measuring, without judging, without wanting to possess. But this gaze brings with it a revelation that the ego fears above all others, the realization that perhaps you never chose anything you've experienced. There comes a moment in awakening when everything you thought you had decided reveals itself to be a performance. It's when the ego, stunned, realizes it's not driving the car, it's the passenger, perhaps not even that, perhaps just the wind hitting the window. Carl Jung said that the greatest wound of human consciousness is discovering it's not free, and the second is discovering it's always been driven by forces it doesn't understand. You believed you chose your profession, your loves, your beliefs, your addictions. But when the veil begins to fall, you realize that each choice was merely the repetition of a pattern, a reflection of a trauma, an unconscious attempt to correct what childhood left unfinished. You married the same abandonment that raised you, worked searching for the love you never received, believed so as not to go mad. The unconscious was always the conductor, the ego, merely the obedient dancer, thinking it invented the steps. When this awareness arrives, the mind shatters. Everything you thought was merit becomes mechanism. Everything you called freedom reveals itself to be instinct. And it is at this moment that awakening becomes a desert, because there is no one to decide anymore. There is only what is. This collapse of free will is the most painful point of the journey. It's when the sense of authorship evaporates. The ego finds itself naked, without the power to say, "I did it." You try to act, but your body moves on its own. You try to think, but thoughts happen unbidden. You try to love, but love ebbs and flows like a tide that doesn't obey the clock. Jung called this the discovery of the autonomous unconscious, the force that moves us beneath what we call will. As this awareness matures, you begin to see the invisible threads that guide you, family complexes, psychic inheritances, collective archetypes, and every memory of the past becomes a confession. I never chose. You realize you've repeated your mother's pattern in the way you give yourself, and your father's in the way you protect yourself. You realize that your fear of making mistakes was never prudence, it was inherited guilt. You realize that even your desire to awaken may have been another unconscious attempt to escape your own suffering. The freedom the ego so defended was merely a cage decorated with ideals. The self, now awakened, begins to dismantle the bars one by one. But the end of the illusion of choice is not the end of life, it is its beginning. When the ego stops claiming authorship, something new begins to act. Jung called it the will of the self, an impersonal, natural, intentionless movement. Like a river that flows unwillingly, it is at this point that life begins to happen through you, no longer for you. The body acts, words emerge, decisions are formed, and everything flows with a precision the ego could never plan. This is the true paradox. When you understand that you control nothing, everything begins to align. Control was the obstacle, surrender, the channel. This is what mystics call acting without acting, and psychoanalysts call the integration of the unconscious. The ego, reduced to what it always was, a momentary interface, is startled by the magnitude of the silence that remains. And in this silence, something sacred happens. You realize that there is no longer I and life, there is only life expressing itself. The illusion of choice dies, but the flow is born. The self begins to move the body, and the body begins to obey the soul. And when this happens, the whole world slows down, and you see, with a piercing clarity, that maybe nothing needs to be fixed. Maybe everything was already perfectly as it was. There comes a time when the ego stops fighting. Not because it has learned, but because it has exhausted itself. After trying to control, understand, fix, and evolve, something inside simply falls silent. And this silence is not giving up, it is revelation. Carl Jung said that the final awakening is the collapse of the illusion that something needs to be changed. Suddenly, you realize that suffering is not asking for a solution, but acceptance. That error is not a detour, but a path. That even your falls had a hidden intelligence, as if life itself were orchestrating each stumble to lead you to wholeness. It's a realization so radical that the ego calls it madness. But it's not madness, it's lucidity. Human beings spend their entire lives trying to improve what was never wrong, and when consciousness expands enough to see this, the ground crumbles. Everything that once moved you, the desire to be better, the impulse to correct yourself, the addiction to evolving, loses its meaning. You understand that the search was your own prison, and it is then that the self reveals itself as what it always was: presence. The perfection Jung spoke of is not the absence of flaws, but the recognition that flaws are part of the design. It is the moment when the observer awakens within their own pain and realizes that nothing is out of place. Even chaos has symmetry. Even trauma has wisdom. Even emptiness has purpose. You begin to realize there is nothing to achieve because everything already is. This realization dissolves the impulse to improve, and the ego despairs, having lived with problems to solve. The whole world revolves around this idea of progress, diets, goals, therapies, religions, all promising a future version of you, purer, freer, more enlightened. But when awakening is true, the search dies. And with it dies hope. Hope, that last trick of time that keeps you chasing a non-existent tomorrow. Without hope, the ego dies of fear. But the soul, freed from the calendar, finally rests. You no longer need to change, not because you are lazy, but because you have realized there is no one to change. What you called you was just the wind moving within the wind. This revelation is so profound, it feels paralyzing. You look at the world and see people trying to fix everything, their bodies, their governments, the planet, each other. And you just watch, not out of indifference, but because you see perfection moving even in the ruins. Jung called this the enlightened paralysis, the stage where the soul has already understood so much that the body still doesn't know what to do with that understanding. It's the silence after the thunder. It's the interval between the ego's last scream and the self's first breath. And it's in this interval that authentic action is born, one that comes not from lack, but from plenitude. You stop acting to achieve and begin acting to express. Like the tree that blossoms, not because it needs to, but because it's in its nature to blossom. This is when doing becomes play again, not obligation. The sacred reveals itself in the everyday. Life, which once seemed like a road to somewhere, reveals itself as a garden that was always ready. The ego dies trying to understand, but the self only smiles, because it always knew nothing needed saving. After the revelation of perfection comes absolute silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind the mind tries to fill with thoughts, but a living, thick, almost palpable silence. It is the absence of any impulse, any will. The body still moves, but the spirit is suspended. Jung called this state the pause between deaths, the interval between the end of the false and the birth of the true. It is sacred paralysis, the moment when the soul refuses to continue pretending. And it is frightening. You feel like you have lost the ability to will. There are no goals, no plans, no desire. Everything that once moved you has lost importance, and the world, which spins at a frantic pace, begins to see you as someone standing still. But within this immobility, there is invisible work. The self is reconfiguring the entire internal structure, replacing the force of the ego, driven by lack, with the force of presence, driven by fullness. But this transition is slow, and the ego calls this slowness failure. It screams, "You are stagnant," but the self whispers, "I am rebuilding you." Sacred paralysis is the fasting of the soul. Everything you did to feel alive, searching, producing, fighting, healing, ceases to function. And emptiness, once seen as an enemy, now becomes a master. Jung said this state is like spiritual incubation, the cocoon that precedes metamorphosis. But the ego hates cocoons. It wants movement. It wants proof that it is evolving. And the self forces it to wait. It is a time when nothing blooms and yet everything germinates. Outwardly there is boredom. Inwardly there is creation. It is in this silence that the soul forges new paths. It is there that the unconscious reorganizes symbols, heals traumas, and reintegrates fragments. Paralysis is only the surface. What is happening deep down is revolution. You cannot rush the process. Haste was the language of the ego. The self speaks slowly. And when you try to do something to get out of it, the universe paralyzes you even more. Because now learning is the opposite of doing. It is remaining. And remaining is the most difficult act for those who have always defined themselves by action. The body feels tired, the heart feels fear, the mind tries to search for explanations. Am I depressed? You ask yourself. But no. What you're feeling is the weight of birth. The old you is dying, and the new you hasn't yet been born. Jung said this is the most sacred moment of the entire journey, the void between two existences. It's the point where the human being learns to trust without understanding. There is no map, no promise, only faith. A faith that is not belief, but surrender. It is learning to breathe within the nothingness. Sacred paralysis is not a punishment. It is proof that the self is taking control. When the ego finally bows to this silence and accepts immobility as part of the process, something begins to pulse. It is weak, almost imperceptible, like the heart of a newborn. It is the new energy of the soul, still timid, still learning to move. And when it fully awakens, what will emerge from the ashes of silence will no longer be motivation. It will be authentic movement. Then, one day, without warning, the silence begins to move. There is no excitement, no explosion, no euphoria, just a gentle, almost invisible movement arising within the void. Carl Jung called this phenomenon action without motive, the beginning of what he saw as the true agency of the self. It is when the human being begins to act not out of necessity, but out of nature. Everything that was effort transforms into expression. You wake up and feel the urge to walk, not to arrive, but because your body wants to breathe. You speak, not to convince, but because your soul wants to vibrate. You create, not for applause, but for overflow. It is at this point that life ceases to be a project and becomes a flow again. Motivation no longer comes from lack, but from abundance. The ego does not understand. It asks, why? And the self answers, because. This is the rebirth after sacred paralysis. It is not the return of the old impulse. It is the emergence of a new energy. Calm, silent, whole. Acting without wanting, doing without purpose, living without reason. This authentic action is the opposite of modern productivity. It doesn't seek results. It manifests essence. Jung said that the true work of the soul begins when the ego stops wanting to be useful. It's the moment you act because it's inevitable, not because it's necessary. The tree doesn't choose to blossom, it blooms. The river doesn't decide to flow, it flows. Life, when lived from the self, becomes a natural unfolding of consciousness. It's a state where what needs to be done does itself. You realize that the right words arrive when they need to, the right people appear effortlessly, and situations unfold as if someone, something greater, is guiding you from within. This is the point at which destiny ceases to be a road and becomes a choreography. The ego, once eager for recognition, begins to disappear like a shadow at sunrise, and the shadow, now integrated, serves as ground. The past no longer weighs you down, it sustains you. Life begins to move like music, and the self dances to it naturally. But this new way of living demands a different kind of courage. The courage to act without guarantees. The courage to not know where the movement leads. The courage to trust the invisible. The ego, accustomed to control, tries to transform even the flow into a method. It wants to practice authentic action. It wants to replicate the spontaneous. And it is at this moment that the self laughs, silently, because the doing of the self cannot be learned, only allowed. It is the end point of the process of individuation, when the human being stops seeking meaning and becomes the meaning. Authentic action is what happens when being and doing become the same. There is no difference between prayer and work, between breathing and creating. Everything is the same gesture, the universe moving through you. Jung said that this is true rebirth, when the individual stops living by will and begins to live by truth. The old motivation has died. The new one doesn't need to be born because it has always been there, just waiting for you to stop pretending you knew the way. And now that the fake is dead, what's left of you? Who are you when you no longer need to pretend to be okay or prove you have a purpose? What happens when silence stops being a threat and becomes home? Carl Jung said that true awakening doesn't bring answers. It gives you burning questions, and maybe that's what you're feeling right now, the burn of truth. The ego wants to go back to dreaming, but the self wants you to wake up. The soul wants you to remain in this void, because it is there that reality breathes. So breathe, feel the weight of this moment. Don't try to understand that you don't need to. Perhaps this immobility is not stagnation, but a calling. Called to exist without a mask, without a goal, without haste. And if all that remains is silence, know this. This is how the universe speaks, when the mind finally falls silent. Now tell me, do you have the courage to live without needing a reason, or will you still keep trying to fix what was never broken? If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.